guys hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Caitlin Iverson, and my thesis is on fairy tales and how they positively impact childhood development. Alex took the land of stories with her to bed that night. She gently flipped through the old pages, being careful not to tear them. Seeing all the colorful illustrations and places and characters again made her feel like she was reading an old scrapbook of sorts. She loved spending time reading about fairy tale characters more than anything. They'd always felt so real and accessible to her. They were the best friends she'd ever had. "I wish we got to choose which world we lived in," Alex said, running her fingers over the illustrations. They were so inviting. In her hands was a world unlike the one she lived in. It was a world unaltered by political corruption or technology. A world where good things came to good people. A world she wanted to be a part of, with all of her being. This excerpt is from Chris Colfer's best-selling middle grade series, The Land of Stories. In this series, the twins, Alex and Connor Bailey, are transported into a world where fairy tales are real. Over the course of the series, the twins explore their favorite fairy tale locations, befriend their favorite heroes, and thwart evil villains. Through the power of fairy tales, the twins learn how to solve problems creatively, how to love and forgive others, and how to grow into capable adults. Over the story, the agency of the twins is emphasized, as they overcome all of the obstacles that they face, using their own intelligence, compassion, and courage. And at the end of the series, both Alex and Connor are able to find their own versions of happily ever after. Alex and Connor's love for fairy tales is something that should be fostered in every child. Children in the real world may not fight dragons or cast magic spells, but they do have to learn how to ask questions, how to solve problems, and how to stand up for others, which are all values that are highly emphasized in fairy tales. Before we go any further, we must ask the question, why read fairy tales at all? And my answer is that in a postmodern society, fairy tales are vital for children because they offer a solution out of what I call the gray zone problem. To explain, in our modern culture, many children are taught that morality is a gray zone. They're taught that there is no set right and wrong, and rather that morality is up to how they feel in their own hearts. As Christians, we know that this is contrary to what is reality, as God has laid forth very clearly in black and white in the Ten Commandments what true morality is. And therefore, fairy tales, with their very clear-cut right and wrong, and good characters and evil villains, can help to bring children out of the gray zone and back into the world of black and white. My thesis statement is that fairy tales have a positive impact on child development because they empower children, enforce moral values, present relatable role models, and instill in children the ability to process the world around them. Ask anyone, and chances are, at some point in their lives, they've read fairy tales. However, professional and parental opinion on these stories may vary. Some people believe that fairy tales have an overall positive impact on children, while others will argue that their negative qualities will outweigh any positive benefits that they have to offer. The people who say that fairy tales have a positive impact will point out that these stories have the potential to guide children morally, as they have very valuable life lessons and characters that can act as relatable role models. Advocates will also point out the social, emotional, and academic advantages that these stories have to offer, as they teach children to face their fears, how to rise up to challenges, and ultimately how to become the best versions of themselves. However, there are some people who point out the negative aspects in fairy tales. They'll argue that these stories have unrealistic plots and stereotypes, especially in regards to gender, which can warp a child's perceptions of reality and of themselves. Opponents will also point out that these stories contain scary elements and violence, which can not only scar a child for life, but can also compromise their behavior as they take over through observation and imitation the actions of villainous characters. Now, before we go any further, we must examine a few key terms that can help us to better understand this thesis. First of all, what are fairy tales? Fairy tales are stories belonging to the overall category of folk tales. Folktales, simply defined, are stories with ordinary protagonists. These ordinary protagonists are supposed to remind us of ourselves, as they have very grounded, down-to-earth concerns with things like getting married and establishing a home, which speaks directly to our own individual needs as readers. There are many different subcategories of folktales, including fables, jokes, myths, novellas, and fairy tales. But fairy tales can be distinguished from these other subgenres by their containing of magical elements. While fairy tales differ vastly from each other based on their story content and the person who is telling them, there are many common attributes that these stories possess that can be used to more easily identify them. For instance, most fairy tales take place in a distant past with no set date, and this is why these stories often begin with "once upon a time." These stories also feature powerful heroes and villains. The heroes of fairy tales seek to improve their situation in life through a journey of self-discovery, while the villains of these stories are the embodiment of everything that is evil in the world. And, of course, as seen in the famous phrase, happily ever after, most fairy tales end with a happy ending. However, this is not a hard and fast rule. Understanding the history and origin of fairy tales is also important for understanding the nature of these stories. Fairy tales originate from the oral tradition, which results in many equally legitimate versions of any given story. To explain, long before medieval and even biblical history, fairy tales were told by an anonymous storyteller to a group of people. And then each of those people in that audience would take that story and then maybe add some elements they thought could make the story better and take away some things that they didn't like and then tell it again to a new audience. And in this way, the same story was told to many people across generations until you end up with the story that we tell today. So, as you may imagine, the story that is Cinderella that we tell today may differ vastly from the version of Cinderella that was told hundreds of years ago. And because of this, fairy tales are a very fluid genre. There's no correct version of the story like Little Red Riding Hood, but rather it's treated as a sum of all of its parts. In later years, the oral culture was infringed upon, per se, by the literary culture. This was first seen in the 16th and 17th centuries when the first collections of Western fairy tales were published. And then again in the 19th century, authors continued to write down these oral tales into the literary format. You may be more familiar with these authors. These include people like the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. And these stories that they have written down have become our primary source for fairy tales in the modern day. In more recent years, the rise of cinema has led to fairy tale film becoming one of the most popular cultural commodities worldwide. Because of this, modern children are exposed to fairy tales through oral, literary, and televisual means, so there is ample opportunity for children to be exposed to these stories. In more recent years, fairy tales have joined the canon of children's literature, which is in of itself a rather recent vintage. Many people may not realize this, but fairy tales were originally intended for adult audiences only. However, cultural shifts have led to a new perspective on these stories, and fairy tales are now commonly utilized for entertainment of young people or as part of the bedtime ritual. Another important term that we must define for this thesis is child development. Childhood, for the sake of this argument, is defined as spanning from ages 3 to 11. And development, simply defined, is the process of gaining experience in a given environment. Early experiences, whether they be positive or negative, lay the foundation for a child's future survival, growth, health, and well-being. There are many factors that can influence the child's development, such as the physical health that they have as they grow up, the culture that they're surrounded by, or the stories that are told to them, like fairy tales. Now that we have a better understanding of the terms that will be used in this thesis, we can now move on to our argumentation section. This thesis seeks to affirm the benefits of fairy tales, or refuting any arguments claiming that these stories are outdated, offensive, or irrelevant. Before we go any further, it must be noted that only a certain type of fairy tales will be examined in this thesis. Thesis, and this includes fairy tales of European origin. Fairy tales are a universal phenomenon. They occur across cultures, but in order to narrow the scope of our argument and make it more specific, we will only examine the fairy tales that originated on the European continent. Also, only fairy tales of the oral and literary tradition will be examined. So fairy tales that originated solely on TV will not be considered to be legitimate fairy tales for the sake of this thesis. There are many benefits that advocates for fairy tales will point out. One of these is that fairy tales have the potential to empower children. Empowerment, simply defined, is a driving force that stimulates personal growth in an individual. There are many ways in which fairy tales can empower children, and one of these ways is by easing a child's fear and anxiety. This can be accomplished through a variety of methods. First of all, fairy tales have very structured plots and archetypes. All fairy tales have a very definite middle, beginning, and end, and the characters share similar virtues and vices across the stories. And, as seen in the Happily Ever After, the heroes nearly always triumph over the villains. This familiarity can bring comfort to children who may fear the unknown and the unexpected. Fairy tales are also commonly utilized for their bedtime advantages. The time before sleep is actually when separation anxiety is at its peak in young children, and reading with an adult caretaker can emphasize a child's importance as a member of the family and also help them to understand the safety of their environment, as well as build stronger relationships between the child and the storyteller. Studies have also proven that fairy tales can help children to analyze fears surrounding danger and death. For instance, one study showed that children who were read the story of Three Little Pigs were able to alleviate their anxiety surrounding an illness that they had by labeling that illness as the Big Bad Wolf. Fairy tales can also empower children by increasing their self-awareness. A 2014 study found that fictional narratives effectively improved a sense of self-worth and well-being in general in children. In a 2016 study, which was done over 353 school children over the course of 2 years, found that narrative therapy improved social and emotional skills in children ranging from 8 to 10 years old. The final way in which fairy tales can empower children is by presenting success and personal growth as a genuine possibility in children's lives. And these stories do this primarily through utilizing the underdog narrative. Fairy tales often feature younger siblings or relatively weaker characters outperforming, outsmarting, or even overpowering older siblings or more powerful rivals. And as children often find themselves to be the weaker, smaller person in the room, they will find this underdog narrative to be relatable and will seek to emulate the actions of these underdog heroes. The second benefit that fairy tales have to offer for children is that they present them with moral values. Stories themselves, as a form of entertainment, can be a catalyst for the development of moral behavior. This is because parents will often employ stories, like fairy tales, in the disciplining of their children by depriving their children of these stories if they happen to misbehave. Fairy tales can also help children to learn virtue through example. For instance, the heroes of these stories constantly demonstrate that selflessness, courage, knowledge, and compassion can lead to eventual success and prosperity. And this consistent pattern of reward for good behavior can help a child to understand the difference between right and wrong action. Once a child recognizes this, they will seek to follow these characters' examples in their own lives. One common theme that is utilized throughout fairy tales is the theme of the victory of good over evil. And this theme can instill the theme of black and white morality. For instance, in the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack is very clearly the good character. He has many virtues as he wants to provide for his family. He's quick-witted in the face of danger, and he's loyal, even towards his family's useless cow. And all of these virtues are what lead him to thwart the giant at the end of the story. However, the giant is very clearly the evil character in this tale. He's aggressive as he wants to grind Jack's bones to make his bread. And he is also reckless, and this leads him to fall from the beanstalk and die. Jack's virtues are shown to be more powerful and valuable during the story than the giant's vice, and his virtues lead him not only to his own success, but also to prosperity for his entire village. However, the giant's vice leads only to his downfall and despair. Another common theme that is utilized in fairy tales is the punishment of evil, and this can help children not only to understand the difference between right and wrong, but can also help them to develop sympathy. According to Time, many children are satisfied and relieved when villains are punished. However, many children will also express sympathy for villains when they meet their eventual downfall. Developing sympathy is an important part of child development, as it can improve a child's social interactions due to a newfound respect for the feelings and opinions of their peers. The third benefit that fairy tales have to offer for children is that they present them with relatable role models. The heroes of fairy tales are often common people leading average lives, and these characters face the problems that children are afraid of having to face in their own lives. Fairy tale heroes often stand up to cruel authority figures, bullies, and intimidating predators. And these characters' desires often align very closely with the child's, as they want very grounded, down-to-earth things like safety, love, acceptance, and success. And when children see themselves reflected in these characters, they will feel more comfortable in themselves and feel inspired to explore their emotions. There are two different types of characters in fairy tales, role models and anti-role models. Let's first look at role models. Role models are the characters that children are supposed to root for, and their actions are to be emulated. These characters will often have admirable qualities that are rewarded at the end of the story, but we must not think that these characters are perfect. In fact, many fairy tale role models have flaws, which makes them more relatable and also can provide learning opportunities for children. To explain, Little Red Riding Hood is a fairy tale role model. She's playful and virtuous as she wants to explore the woods and help her grandmother, but she is also heedless of warning, as her ignoring of her mother's warnings leads her to get into trouble with the wolf in the story. When children read this story, they're able to recognize Little Red Riding Hood's virtues, but they're also able to recognize where she falls short and will hopefully learn to avoid such foolishness in their own lives. The second type of characters in fairy tales are anti-role models. Anti-role models are the characters that children are supposed to root against, and their actions are not to be copied. These characters often act as symbolic representations of a child's internal self, as the qualities that children may struggle with are exemplified through these characters, and this can help to grow a child's awareness of their own flaws. For instance, in the story of Snow White, the evil stepmother acts as a warning against the dangers of narcissism and jealousy. The final benefit that fairy tales have to offer for children is that they aid young people in processing reality. Fairy tales bridge the gap between imagination and real human behavior by way of metaphors and morals. Fairy tales have been shown to demonstrate the following benefits. They can increase a child's social skills through the example of compassionate, thoughtful characters like Thumbelina and Snow White, which can show children how to correctly deal with others in a social situation. Fairy tales have also been shown to increase a child's academic performance due to constant practice and exposure of skills while they read and listen to stories. For instance, fairy tales have been shown to increase a child's listening ability, their receptive and expressive language, and their reading, writing, and speaking skills. Finally, fairy tales have been shown to increase a child's imagination and dramatic play. Play is often regarded as a very fruitless activity by adults, but they are wrong. It's actually a mechanism by which children process information about themselves, others, and life in general. The more expansive a child's imagination is, the more effective their play will be, and the better they will be able to understand the world around them. Now that we have examined the benefits that fairy tales have to offer, we will now examine some of the pitfalls that opponents of these stories will try to argue for and point out why ultimately fairy tales are crucial for children. The first pitfall that opponents will try to point out is is that these stories are unrealistic. Opponents will say that fairy tales often show a disregard for the struggle of their main characters, as they fail to show how a character's struggles impact their emotional and mental well-being, as these stories often place more importance on the happily ever after at the end of the story. Dinah Goldstein, a narrative photographer, sought to emphasize this issue in her narrative photography pieces, Fallen Princesses. For these pieces, she took models who were dressed up as very recognizable fairy tale princesses, but then put them in situations that you might not expect. For instance, with the character of Cinderella, she put a model dressed up in Cinderella's beautiful ball gown, but then put her in a very shady bar, surrounded by questionable individuals. She's at a table all by herself with a glass of alcohol in her hand, and she looks quite dejected. Goldstein argued that she wanted this photo to capture what she believed would be the trauma lingering in a character like Cinderella after years of neglect and abuse from her stepfamily. While this photo is certainly creative and thought-provoking, it fails to capture what is the true essence of fairy tales, which is, at the end of the day, these stories are supposed to be stories of hope. These stories consistently demonstrate that hard work and patience can combat the obstacles in life that we as finite beings can't control. Fairy tale characters go through hard things to show that life is difficult, but there is also light and happiness, and this is why these stories do not dwell in the realm of hopelessness forever. There is also a general discrimination against children's stories in general. According to Wenham, many children's stories are regarded as subordinate parts of literature. Many adults will just simply dismiss these stories as ridiculous and outlandish. However, many people ignore that silliness actually alludes to something far more serious, and this can be seen in the story of Princess and the Pea. In the story, a princess must accomplish a rather ridiculous test to prove that she is a royal. She must sleep atop a stack of 100 mattresses and be able to feel a singular pea that has been placed underneath. This story faced a lot of criticism even when it was first written, and Hans Christian Andersen attempted to respond to this criticism by explaining that his story was meant to highlight the importance of sensitivity and nobility. So the princess's highly attuned physical sensitivity actually alludes to her far deeper emotional sensitivity, which would make her a kind and compassionate ruler of her people. And thus, a story that seems rather shallow on the surface actually goes far deeper. The second pitfall that opponents of fairy tales will try to point out is that these fairy tales feature aggression and violence and is therefore harmful for children. For instance, many people will point out the frightening characters and conflicts that commonly arise in these stories. In the story of Hansel and Gretel, the witch wants to eat both of the children for breakfast, which is admittedly a rather terrifying situation. In response to these elements, parents will often try to avoid these concepts altogether. One parent said, "I skip them, I don't read them." And another parent said that what you imprint on a child's soul lasts there forever. While these parents' concerns are definitely warranted, they overlook the role that scariness plays in children's literature. In fact, scariness actually plays a larger role for children than it does for adults, because scariness in stories actually helps to serve as a very safe, simulator-type environment by which children can experience the emotions of fear and anxiety without any real-life consequences. The characters in fairy tales will model coping skills for children, which can help them come to grips with negative emotions. The real world is full of frightening situations and harmful people, and fairy tales are a very safe conduit to convey this information to children. Through fairy tales, children can have a safe space to explore their feelings about this reality and also to ask questions of their storyteller. Opponents will also point out that anti-role models in stories have the potential to lead children astray, as studies in literature show that children will take over verbal and physical aggression from the stories that they read, and this can lead to imitation of villains and other unhealthy practices. However, this issue can be remedied with simple parental guidance, often taking the form of parents talking with their children while they read. For instance, a parent can examine the actions of evil characters with their child by asking questions like, why do you think the witch did that? Do you think that she was being kind? And in this way, a child is forced to confront the evil action of the character and understand why it's not to be copied. Parents can also contrast the difference between heroes and villains by highlighting good behavior against the backdrop of less commendable behavior. For instance, a parent can ask, what makes Cinderella kinder than her stepmother? However, at the end of the day, if a child insists upon unhealthy practices, then it's up to the parent to put a stop to that, typically through disciplinary action. The final pitfall that opponents will try to glean from these stories is that fairy tales often feature problematic stereotypes, especially in regards to gender. The gender stereotypes that are most often attacked are in regards to females. For instance, advocates will say that fairy tales promote the feminine beauty ideal, which states that the most important thing about a woman is her attractiveness. And this, opponents argue, will lead to obsession, shallowness, and vanity in young girls. Fairy tales also contribute to the phenomenon known as princess culture, which is a developmental phase in young girls marked by an obsession with princesses. This can become apparent in a young girl's desire to dress up like a princess or wanting to be told stories about these characters again and again. However, before we throw princesses and other unattractive characters under the bus, we must realize that the benefits of princess culture are actually far greater than its downsides. For instance, Coyne, a professor at the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University, had a 4-year-old daughter who was obsessed with dressing up as princesses. Coyne worried that this behavior was unhealthy for her daughter, so in 2016, she surveyed over 300 preschool children and their parents, finding that in the short term, princess culture had an overall negative effect on children. But her research did not stop there. 5 years later, in 2021, she conducted another survey which completely flipped her findings. She found that in the long run, fairy tales had an overall positive impact on young girls, as they promoted the belief that education, relationships, and careers were equally important in both men and women, and thus fairy tales and princess culture helped young girls to become more comfortable in their femininity. The second issues that opponents of these stories will try to glean is from male stereotypes. Male stereotypes are not as heavily studied in fairy tales, but there are still some issues that people will try to find. For instance, opponents will point out that these stories will often portray men with hyper-masculine traits. Saxby pointed out that these characters are often portrayed as rescuers, self-sufficient, heroic, and persevering. And males are more often judged by hierarchical values like height and birth order than women are. However, it must be pointed out that caricature is very important in literature because exaggerated qualities can actually point to virtue. For instance, the qualities of these hypermasculine characters points to the deeper qualities of courage, selflessness, and strength. And this can teach young boys to stand up for themselves and others and to strive for self-improvement. Now, before you go, I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine a world in which children do not read fairy tales, a world in which people do not care about the values that these stories have to teach. In this world, children are led to question their very identity. They act without regard for the consequences of their actions or how they will affect other people. In this world, they blindly attempt to make meaning for themselves in a reality that seems increasingly meaningless. Despair and confusion abound, and as many parents can attest, this world bears a striking resemblance to our own. Now I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine a world in which children do read fairy tales, a world in which people genuinely care about the values that these stories have to offer. Fairy tales are a tried and true tool for the betterment of oneself, strengthen the bond between a parent and a child, or a child and a role model. And fairy tales ultimately present the lesson of a world of hope, in which children can have the courage to make a difference in their own lives and in the lives of others. At the end of the day, fairy tales present the reality of happily ever after as a genuine possibility in children's lives.